I've been asked to introduce our next speaker, Sara Carr, who's a faculty member at Northeastern University. Her teaching and research focuses on the connections between landscape, human health, urban ecology, and design. Her current book in progress is The Topography of Wellness, Health, and the American Urban Landscape. It examines the landscape responses to 6 historical urban epidemics and the implication for current and future practice. She holds a Master of Architecture from Tulane and a Master of Landscape Architecture and doctorate in environmental planning from the University of California, Berkeley, where she was the co-founding editor of the ASLA award-winning Ground Up journal. She is a licensed architect who's been working professionally in New Orleans and the San Francisco Bay Area. Her research and representational work has been exhibited at San Francisco Planning and Urban Research Gallery, the Spur Gallery that's called, the National Building Museum in Washington, DC, and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. In 2017, she held a residential Mellon Fellowship in Urban Landscape Studies at the Dumbarton Oaks. Prior to arriving at Northeastern, she held a joint appointment in the School of Architecture and Office of Public Health Studies at the University of Hawaii and Manoa, where she worked with several local nonprofits and agencies on evaluation and design initiatives, including the Hawaii Department of Health and the Native Hawaiian Health Program at Queens Medical Center and the Outrigger Duke, forgive my pronunciation, Kahanamoku Foundation. She's also an advisory board member at Design 4, Active Sacramento, a cross-sector award-winning team that advocates for and advises on active design initiatives. So very pleasant to introduce you, and I'm going to pass it to you, Sara.
Thanks, Terry, and thanks, Dave, for having me here today. So,
of course, yeah. So, Sara, thanks for coming, and you know, you come from a different background than some of our other guests, and I think it's, you know, the reason I asked you to come and speak is because your background is very pertinent to what we're all dealing with right now, which is disaster, but also pandemic and pandemia, and how we deal with it and how it changes our lives and how we can design for it, which I find utterly fascinating, and I'm also completely ignorant on. So very excited to have you here. I guess I would just start and kick it off by if you could just kind of tell us how you got into this field and some of the research that you've been doing. And I understand you have a book that you were planning on publishing this like basically in the last month or two, and then that got pushed. So everything's getting pushed, everything's on pause, everything's on hiatus. But if you could just tell us how you got into this, it would be really great to hear.
Yeah, sure. I'll show some slides in a little bit, but yeah. I mean, just sort of my origin story is, and it's interesting you say that I'm coming from a different field, because I feel like I've been talking so much to architecture and urban planning audiences for the past 5 months. We're talking to architecture and urban planning journals. So I think it's actually, this is a great opportunity to be here today and to get questions from all of you that are in, you know, sort of different realms of design. So yeah, I mean, you know, I got into design because essentially I wanted to go to art school. My father wanted me to be an engineer, and so architecture school was the compromise between us. And so I didn't know that much about it. I went to architecture school and just ended up loving it. I mean, I really loved the opportunity to think about how you shape the people's environments. The way I got into design and health was actually after school. I wanted to stay in New Orleans, and I had some friends that were working at an architecture firm that did healthcare design. And again, sort of, I didn't know that much about it, but I started working in the realm of healthcare design, and I was just really fascinated by the connection between design, everything from, you know, interior design, paint colors, the layouts of rooms, views out windows, and the connection to health. So when you're doing healthcare design, a lot of architects aren't really into it because it's quite rigid. You have a lot of obviously you have a lot of regulations, you know, that go into it. You have a big book called the AIA healthcare standards
Mhm.
that you have to follow. But I really liked it because it was like a puzzle piece, you know, from designing rooms to designing new hospitals where you are talking to doctors and nurses and techs and trying to learn about the patient experience and sort of bring it all together. So
Okay.
so that's how I got my start
Mhm.
in design.
I would think that the constraints that that book and really just healthcare demands are actually kind of would be interesting for
Yeah,
designers, you know.
yeah,
So why don't you show us some of the research you've been doing and some of what you're working on?
sure. Well, today, what I try and emphasize is that health and design in the built environment is actually all around us,
Mm,
right? And even though I think when I talk about health and architecture, people immediately think healthcare, and I think yes, that's actually where I started out, right? Is in healthcare design.
yeah.
But I had a career shift, which I'll talk a little bit about here, and it was actually a career shift that was born out of disaster. So as I mentioned, I started in healthcare, and I was interested in that book, sort of the puzzle pieces of it. But I was also interested in this research that was about landscapes
Mm,
in healthcare centers, and particularly these are two examples, not projects that I worked on, but ones in Boston on the left, the Yawkey Cancer Center, Good Samaritan Infusion Clinic on the right. These are landscapes that were in hospitals, but adjacent to chemotherapy clinics, where
mm,
people could look out at these landscapes, and they found it actually relaxed people that were getting chemotherapy, and it made them more receptive to the therapy. And there was a lot of what we call evidence-based research that showed that people in hospitals with exposure to green space, it actually does lower those stress levels, and it does accelerate healing outcomes, right?
wow.
And
Wow.
the sterile environment that you might think of that unfortunately you're exposed to in a lot of hospitals. So,
Mhm.
so where my life and many others' lives blew up is, as I mentioned, I was living in New Orleans at the time, and so I was actually living in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina hit, and so
Yikes.
yeah, so like most others that were lucky enough, I evacuated the city for 6 weeks, but I came back 6 weeks later, and it was still pretty rough,
Mm,
obviously.
mhm.
And I spent the next year of my life doing FEMA surveys. I was doing rehabilitation for our clients, but I was also attending a lot of community planning meetings at the time. And there's a lot of talk about how would New Orleans build back healthier. Sorry, this is auto running and I didn't mean
No, no problem.
to. So I got to thinking about, how does the urban landscape heal or harm us sort of in the wake? And basically I was interested in the urban landscape, meaning the parks, the streets, everything around buildings. How does that work as a healthcare environment where it
Right.
was the buildings as well, especially in the wake of climate change? And so
Mhm.
that's what led me to go to UC Berkeley and get my Master of Landscape Architecture, and then eventually a PhD in environmental planning that was basically all exploring this question.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I had another revelatory moment when I read this quote from Karen DeSalvo, the U.S. Department, who was then the interim secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and she said, "One's zip code is now a better indicator of your health than genetic code." And just a lot of things clicked for me, and I was glad that maybe other people were starting to see the importance of place, right? And of course, zip code indicates a lot of other things. Of course, socioeconomic status, right? Your access to food,
Yep.
um, ability of housing. But it speaks to the importance of the built environment, right? Not just the buildings, but everything that brings them together as well.
Mhm.
So yeah, so that's what led me to write the book, which you so kindly mentioned. This is a cover design I just got a few weeks ago, actually. And as Dave mentioned, yes, I was supposed to publish this book this fall. I turned in the manuscript right before the pandemic hit the United States, and then of course everything got held up. And so I'm getting the manuscript back actually right now to sort of write a COVID relevant introduction and conclusion that will tie it
Right.
back. So that's what was really interesting is this entire time I had been doing this research and thinking about how actually historically the environments we inhabit have always been designed around different epidemics. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, is sort of like illnesses as a disaster, more or less. And I'll tie it back to the beginning in a little bit. So yeah, so very broadly, the thesis is when I started to look into the research, I found out we've always designed our environments to control our different understandings of disease. And we can loosely put it in 3 eras of miasma, germs, and behavior, right, as the major epidemics of the 20th century. You have a lot of great, actually I have a lot of New York examples in here today, so we can talk about, you actually can see it all around you in New York.
Okay.
Yeah, so starting with miasma, the idea of miasma is that that in post-industrial revolution, if you think about what the built environment was like at this time, there's no coordinated waste removal, right? Lots of slaughterhouses in cities next to schools. And so this is a very typical scene, right?
Wow.
The air was filthy, the water was filthy, and there were these mass outbreaks of cholera and yellow fever. So obviously people thought that they could actually catch disease just by breathing in the air around us. And that's what miasma theory is they didn't know that you had to actually ingest the bacteria that caused cholera and yellow fever, right? But it was very scary, just like we're living in a scary time right now. And if you think about it, think back to the early days of the pandemic too, where nobody really knew how you caught COVID-19. Right? Even more so than that, because these were such violent diseases. It's not just, this is just what it looked like in the streets, but this is what it looked like in housing too. So the housing for a lot of people was very dark. It was very dense. There was no private bathrooms, right, to wash. And so there was a sanitation issue internally as well.
Wow.
So what came was this massive push to sanitize the streets, to clean up housing, to bring fresh air, daylight, and water to everybody that lived in the city. And so sort of the first major move to redesign our cities was this installation of waste infrastructure that would take wastewater actually underground, right, and away as fast as possible from where people were living. And that was actually very successful in combating a lot of these diseases that we're talking about. What's interesting is that a lot of American cities at the time, they were also taking cues from European cities. And there's some theories here that European cities were working off the discovery of William Harvey's discoveries about how heart powered blood circulation. And so there was this idea about more one-way streets, wider streets to push fresh air through. It would work. A city was like a body, right? And so the idea was to bring fresh air to all corners of the city. So it's really quite a remarkable transformation. If you look at this picture, this is from Harper's Weekly. These are similar street corners, just 2 years apart.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you can see there's a lot more order in the streets. You can see that sort of dank water is taken away. And these are a lot of the streets that we travel, that we walk on today. And of course, it's actually the same waste infrastructure. A lot of that is still being used underground.
Oh my Lord.
Yeah. It's been there over 100 years, and so it's going to be due for repair soon.
Yeah, I would say. So that's why Soho always has like a little bit of an odor to it. Is that what you're?
Well, I don't. Probably for other reasons, right? It's a lot better than it would have been.
Yeah.
So at the same time, to use another New York example, another way architects and landscape architects and urban planners were trying to breathe fresh air into cities was through parks and trees. Of course, in New York, you may know Frederick Law Olmsted, who's thought of the father of landscape architecture. Maybe less known as he actually started out as a public health officer. He was actually a sanitation officer for New York State. And so he used that scientific knowledge to kind of leverage the need for parks and street planting and all of that in cities. And I think it's really remarkable reading his writings from over 100 years ago, where he's talking about how sunlight and foliage would disinfect air, that trees will mechanically purify the air by screening it, and also talking about the importance of parks where people could escape from the city. for their mental health as well. And now these are all things that have been proven through empirical research now.
Mhm.
That he sort of instinctually knew it. He knew the connection. And so it's really quite forward thinking to read these writings from 1870 and know that parks actually do provide these services. We call them ecosystem services now, but he's writing about it very eloquently. So, you know, and then second era, thinking about germs, after vaccine theory, then people were not that interested in sort of the design of the environment anymore. They said, well, actually, all of our diseases, they can be cured by vaccines now, right? So we don't have to pay attention to the built environment. And I would say we're kind of on the cusp of that kind of thinking now, where I think the built environment actually is very important to think about how it forms COVID-19 mortality, but we can talk about that a little bit at the end. What was happening though, is that even though vaccines were around, architects and urban planners were still using, I would say, the aesthetics of sterilizations and germ theory to build a lot of their buildings. And one example we can see here is with, you know, Le Corbusier's writings. And he really talked about sort of exact units of air and light and temperature that would have to be in each of his apartment buildings. And so basically he's thinking about sunlight and fresh air and water as vaccinations, right, to keep people healthy in his units. But, you know, where those ideas sort of failed is where he was applying them to public housing. Now, he didn't design the Williamsburg housing, which is here on the right. He did design the hypothetical model that's on the left. But I think if you look at these two together, you can see a direct relationship, right? So even though Le Corbusier only has one building in the United States, it's in Boston, next to Harvard, actually. These ideas carried over to a lot of the public housing we saw in urban renewal, which was disastrous for many reasons, mostly because, you know, you're often taking that one perfect unit, but just repeating it over and over again. And that doesn't necessarily make a community. It doesn't necessarily make for a healthy piece of housing. This language of germs was really used ruinously throughout the mid-century. If you think about at this time, cancer became the leading cause of mortality in the United States. And people thought that it could be targeted as a germ, that we could come up with a cancer vaccine at the time when it first became prevalent. But of course, that wasn't true. That said, while people were trying to figure out how to cure cancer, a lot of writers and geographers were using sort of the unknowability of cancer to compare it to urban blight or urban disinvestment, which was also happening in a lot of cities at the time. And they were warning people that if you didn't eradicate urban blight, then it would spread to other places, most notably the suburbs, where a lot of the white population had fled to at this time. And so, you know, again, negatively, architects and urban planners were using this language of germs to build a case for eradication, actually, of entire neighborhoods, and of course, entirely almost Black and brown neighborhoods. And this is an illustration from urban planner Elil Sarnen's book, The City, Its Growth, Its Decay, Its Future, where on the left, he's showing an unhealthy cell, on the right, a healthy cell, but he's using this as a model for new urban planning. So, and then the last era, you know, which I had written about, this is the last part of the book, obviously pre-pandemic, was about how a lot of landscape and urban planning and architecture discourse as of late was sort of around how architecture and urban planning controlled behavior, especially in terms of giving people opportunity for physical activity and food access. And this is in response to, you know, the obesity crisis of the late 20th century, early 21st century. And what they're pointing to basically were suburban landscapes such as this, saying like, well, these very car-centric landscapes that we've built without regulation over the past several decades, people are not walking for their daily activities anymore, right? Children can't walk to school, you can't walk to the grocery store. And this is in part contributing to the obesity crisis. And so what we saw, again, pre-pandemic, was this movement to build what we call walkable neighborhoods, right? You've probably all heard this, right? But they all kind of look like this. They all sort of have a similar aesthetic. And, you know, for me, I sort of question, like, is this applicable to everywhere? And again, like all of the movements I've shown before, sometimes it's really hard to get something like this without really dealing with the realities of the built environment and something more incremental, right? This isn't ideal, and it's great to look at, but how do we start to really grapple with the environment that we've built over time, and how that affects us? So yeah, I'm trying to form some sort of nascent thoughts on COVID-19, but what I think is most fascinating about it is that what we see in COVID-19 is it's actually, what we know about its spread is it might be a combination of miasma, germs, and behavior, right? We know it's airborne. We are cleaning our hands, which is good. We're cleaning our surfaces. Maybe some of you are still sanitizing your groceries because that was a concern. And it's changed our behavior. Like, we're socially distancing and we're quarantining, right? And so I don't know about you, but I certainly felt like the past 8 months has felt like a century in many. I don't know. It's felt like a century, and it's felt like 2 weeks in many respects, depending on the weeks. And so we're seeing all these ideas about how disease spread all around us. And so, yes, of course, designers, especially architects and urban planners, are trying to figure out, like, what does this mean for architecture? And so, there's been a lot of speculation. I mean, for one, I don't think it's going to be like this. This is the conversion of an open plan office, right? Are we going to have these plexiglass dividers everywhere with these little cells on the side? I don't think it's going to look like this for much longer, we can hope. And I get a little bit disgusted thinking about cleaning the inside of those.
It's like being in a wine glass almost.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it looks great, but this is not our future, right? And I hope, as a parent with children in school, I hope this is not our future as well.
Oh my Lord.
These interim measures to keep people distant. And but I have to be honest, I don't think it's going to look like this either for much longer. But what I would advise, as somebody that's been studying sort of the history of epidemics and built environment for almost 10 years now, I'm trying to think about what we can find that's consistent, right, through all those eras. And I know we wanted to talk a little bit about how we go forward, or what recommendations you would have. And so I would just say a few things, and I'd love to get some ideas from the audience as well, or Dave, talk to you about your ideas. So if there's any consistencies throughout history, I would say this. One is that healthy housing, fresh air, fresh water, daylight, and green space for all, that is still a priority, right? We have to think about all the communities that did not have this pre-pandemic, and those are the same communities, specifically Black and Brown and immigrant communities, which have always been disadvantaged, that have always been vulnerable to these diseases over time. A lot of them still do not have these safe provisions. I mean, just thinking about Flint, Michigan, right? And probably many communities that you know of in the Bronx. This is still the #1 priority, and that will keep us, that will mitigate a lot of the worst effects of disease, if we can start with that. In the beginning of the pandemic, I got a lot of calls from news outlets, the New York Times for one, saying, is this the end of density? But when they were asking that, they were thinking about a very specific type of density, and that they were worried that this sort of like walkable urban density was in danger. And I don't think that is, but we do need to worry about housing like this, right? People, especially essential workers, that are crowded, that don't have that access to green space, that don't have that space to quarantine if somebody does get sick. And this is something we need to concentrate. That will actually make us more pandemic resilient. The other thing is that health has also been wielded as a tool of segregation, displacement, and gentrification, and we can't let that happen again. I talked about it more explicitly with urban renewal, but the fact is, even Central Park, probably the most celebrated healthy landscape, which was designed by a revered landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, was also a very outspoken abolitionist. That said, Central Park was still built on Seneca Village, which was a thriving African-American township, right? And was cleared out and deemed a slum before it was built there. So that is a very complicated part of his legacy that we have to grapple with now, and we have to think about if we start to transform our urban landscapes in the wake of COVID-19. I mean, there's also evidence that communities that were redlined, these are communities that are more subject to health effects like air pollution, soil pollution. Sometimes in the Bay Area, you have some communities where, and these are still largely Black neighborhoods, and the asthma rate is 3 times as high as it is of white neighborhoods. And so by using health as a tool of segregation, and that is, remember that many Black people could not buy homes in white areas because their health was deemed to be lesser than white people, that their mortality rate was higher. And of course, that was because they were being denied access to services. And so we've still conscribed them to what I would call a landscape of risk, because these red line neighborhoods are near factories. They are near freeways, right, that are keeping them sick and have now left them more vulnerable to COVID-19 mortality. And the language of health was also used to quarantine immigrants, and this is Chinatown in San Francisco, which was within the city, but its borders were closed because the Chinese were thought to be sick. And again, this is a recurring pattern. If we think about some of the earliest, I don't want to call it discourse, right, but kind of the ugliest portions of the conversation in the early days of the pandemic, that it was brought over from China, and what do we do about that? And so, we also live in a landscape where we have effectively quarantined our most vulnerable, but still leaving them more vulnerable to sickness. And then just to end, I would say though, as thinking about a positive way moving forward, I would just end with this. A lot of things we can do in our built environment to achieve climate change resilience, they can also help us achieve pandemic resilience in the future. And that is, again, as I mentioned, if you have the basic provisions of green space, fresh air, fresh water for everybody, right, that will keep people healthier. It is also healthier for our climate, right, not to have paved over areas. This is actually a picture from the Camp Fire in California last year. And those wildfires broke up because we are building closer and closer to wildland habitats, right, which would have naturally burned right through some wildfire management, but we're building too close for them, which is also bad for our climate, right, and it puts people at health risk as well as mortal risk. Green infrastructure, more parks, thinking about cleaner industry. I guess building to mitigate climate change and building to mitigate pandemics, a lot of it can be found in the same solutions. And that's where I think my research is going in the future, is thinking about those intersections, and especially how they can achieve health equity more than anything else, because we still have a lot of work to do in achieving that in the first place.
That's amazing. And I actually never thought about that until just now. Do you think, I guess the question I would ask is, could the pandemic, the current one we're in, be the thing that changes minds about climate change? If we're to think of them, if the response is equivalent or similar, could this pandemic be the thing that maybe changes things? If these massive fires on the West Coast aren't, could this be it?
I don't know. It's an uphill climb. And I'll tell you one thing that is just like really set off alarm bells for me is, there's no positives to the pandemic, but think about, the early days when a lot of people were working from home again, and there was a lot of decreased car traffic. And I had friends in Los Angeles that said, oh, we can finally see the skyline, right? There was no,
yeah.
I don't know how it was in New York as well. It was probably clear. But people are starting to return to work, and the CDC, because there's been no investment in overhauling our public transit system, which is also, a form of climate change resilience. You have the Center for Disease Control saying like, well, you should drive your car instead, right? And so if you think about all these people that would have been taking commuter rail or taking the subway or whatever or any kind of public transit to work, that are taking cars instead, that's going to set back a lot of that. And so again, I think I feel like my work now, I feel like a lot of my work beforehand was telling people that, okay, health outcomes aren't because of individual choices. People don't have all these choices because of the makeup of their built environment, right? They don't have the choice to walk. They don't have the choice to go to a park.
They don't have the privilege to do
they
it.
don't have the privilege.
Is really what it is, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They don't have the privilege of doing that because, yes, people make their own choices, but the built environment plays a large, where streets are, where they go, that plays a large part in what your sort of daily life is like. So now I feel like the uphill climb is saying, like, look, climate change and the pandemic are related. They're twinned, right? And there's a lot of, we don't have to think about solutions as one or the other. Obviously getting the vaccine, getting over this is the first priority. But then we have to think about sort of long-term solutions in the environment that target both.
I feel like I have to mention one thing, which is that Sarah Turnbull, who was a product designer and industrial designer during the mid 20th century and later 20th century, she actually inadvertently designed the N95 mask for 3M Corps. So I had to put that out there because it speaks to the fact that designers of all stripes could have a hand in this. I mean, you focus specifically on urban planning and design of urban spaces, disaster resilient communities, which I want to talk a little bit about. But designers of any kind, I mean, just the design, I was wondering, well, I guess the way to put this is, could you talk about the design process and design thinking and how that those general things can be geared towards creating, climate change and pandemic response?
Yeah, well, I think I think designers should be consulted because design thinking, as we know, is complex thinking and it's systems thinking, right? We're naturally used to thinking about, okay, how do you take all of these issues and sort of visualize them in a product, right, or in a piece of art, right,
Right.
that communicates its danger instead. And so with architecture and landscape architecture, we're thinking about buildings and parks, right, that address all these things. And I think the other value of design thinking is putting yourself in other people's shoes. And ultimately, both the climate, and I talked a little bit about it at the end, but both the climate change crisis and the pandemic crisis are only going to be solved when people change their behavior.
Right.
And I think another really valuable skill designers have is like we put ourselves in the place of other people and we build that empathy, right? And so we can only change people's behavior if we understand their perspective and where they're coming from and how we can sort of provide those nudges in behavior and get them to understand the severity of these crises.
Oh, I never actually thought about it that way, and that's incredibly stated. Thank you for that. I also think I need to mention that today is 7 days since the 2020 election, the United States election, probably the most important one of living memory, certainly in my life. But what I would ask you is that, say, for example, President-elect Biden just put together his pandemic response team. I think just yesterday he announced it. It has like a lot of heavy hitters on it. And if a President-elect Biden were to call you into his office and say, Professor Carr, we're looking at all these things, and I love your work, and I need some ideas, right? For what things should we be asking? Where should we be sort of dedicating our resources in the next 100 days to make sure that our not just pandemic response, but our cities, our public policy, our climate change policies are going to be most effective? Would you have like a list, like a top 5 or a top 3 of priorities?
I mean, for me, and I don't know, this is maybe, again, just thinking from my perspective. I am working with some colleagues at MIT right now, and we're thinking about pandemic resilient schools. And we're working with some great students now to thinking about how are schools retrofitted so kids can be back in school consistently, right? Because that's a huge equity issue right now. And a large part of that is outdoor classrooms. Our students at MIT are designing outdoor classrooms in Massachusetts, which is no insignificant feat. Thinking about how they're gonna work all seasons, but also how schools can be retrofitted for more natural ventilation, because that's really the key. And actually, all the things the modernists did wrong that I showed, sort of like wrong templates for public housing, one thing that they did do right was this concentration on fresh air and light, sort of naturally pushed through. It's really interesting. So we've been talking about school design of the past 20 years. And what's interesting is the schools we're looking at in Cambridge that were built in the 20s and 30s, they have natural ventilation because it was before air conditioning, right?
Right.
But once we had air conditioning and heating, and more consistent and central
That's
heating,
right. Yeah.
then they become a lot more closed off. Also because there was this pedagogical notion. I don't know, what your high school was like. The high school I went to was built in the late 70s and 80s, and it hardly had any windows because it was thought then that it would be too distracting. Like it would lead to worse learning outcomes. So the schools we're looking at from that same time period is the same. They hardly have any windows. They hardly have any windows, and so it's a real tough task to get that natural ventilation in. So schools, number one.
Yeah.
Because again, this is where climate change resilience and pandemic resilience are related. If you have more natural ventilation and you're less reliant on energy heavy systems, right, that's better for climate change, and it's a longer lasting building as well. And so that's another consistency, right, that we can see over time. And then of course, I think the second emergency is how do you convince people that public transit is safe again and actually expand public transit. And that's one thing, I'm hopeful for Joe Biden, our first Amtrak president. Maybe we'll finally get that infrastructure bill passed. But even though, for a large part, public transit is safe, and we can see that in places that are populated much more densely, like Japan and South Korea. Public transit has not been a form of outbreak, but I think you remember, especially in New York, a lot of these early news articles were like, oh, the virus has spread because people, were taking public transit. I think a lot of that's been disproven, but the narrative, like again, the fear is there, and we don't know how it's going to last if we don't take drastic steps to address that fear that people have public transit. For a public transit system that needed to be overhauled in the first place, right? Then again, it's really dreadful for climate change. The one thing we can't do right now is force people back into their cars, because that's an equity issue, it's a climate issue, it's an economic issue.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. It's funny you mentioned the air conditioning and the venting, because I was reading about Carnegie Hall and this construction of Carnegie Hall, which was William Tuttle. And I what I was reading was that this is, again, before the days of air conditioning. What they had devised to cool people down was this massive, like, chambered system, ducts basically, that basically rolled over in the back of the house a giant slab of ice that they would just bring in ice, and they would blow air over this thing, and then it would get sucked out the back. And it seemed like a very elegant, old-timey solution to what is now like a huge waste of energy. And although I love AC, don't get me wrong, I'm not gonna ever turn mine off, but it's it's an interesting solution that, who knows, that could be a design solution in the future for helping airflow and controlling airflow.
Right.
I have a couple interesting questions from the audience. One of them is, how can one target those areas or communities that are housing more than a family of 5, like larger families? It is difficult to receive help. Does this include creating new housing layouts, new housing communities? Because this is a challenging thing,
Yeah, it is extremely challenging, which is why I get I don't know, I get a little bit angered at maybe seeing this architecture and design discourse. It's about building completely new models, right, of housing, which have never worked in the past. Like, actually, you're just displacing people. So it's a hard question, but I do think we need to look at housing where people live. And I would say something I learned in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina is it doesn't matter how risky you tell people their home is, it is still their home, and they will hold on to it no matter what. And a lot of that is because housing is also quite unaffordable, right, in many places. So it's a combination of things. It's not just about the design. Although we need to repair, basically. We can't start whole. We do need to start asking about repairing. We do need to, I think we can see a lot of places where a little bit more density would not be unwelcome, right? But not to a point where it's crowding. And those are two different things, I would add. Like, crowding is different from density. We can build more humane buildings a little bit taller, and we can put them in other areas that are not built up enough. And for me, I also think about, what's going to be the aftermath of the built environment landscape in COVID-19 with, let's see who's still working from home permanently, right? And I saw a proposal, I think it was in the Times, thinking about all these empty office spaces right now too, and could they be put towards affordable housing? And could they also be, and that would serve a couple purposes, not just putting more housing into the market, but also spreading it out among the city, right? So people are not so far away from their jobs as well. And so I don't know, I think it'll be interesting to see after the pandemic passes, what road infrastructure is still being used, from streets to parking lots, and what's going to happen with this unused office space, unused shop space. Can we use that to think about sort of more mixed use communities, and again, like building more communities for people where they live? And perhaps the work from home, the move to work from home was probably 10 years off anyway. It just was really accelerated overnight. But now that we have it, can we put it towards more creative and more humane and healthier uses?
Yeah, that actually answers one of the other questions from the audience, which is how will streets and streetscapes change due to the pandemic long term? But do you have any thoughts on that? Like, are there trends that are maybe amplified by the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's seen the trend towards outdoor dining, right? Which is nice. I would say it's a little bit problematic in that it sort of privatizes public space, right? And it's hard for especially people that are maybe disabled, right, to travel streets. So there's a lot of complications by doing this sort of like ad hoc takeover of the streets. I would love to see more streets and parking lots turned to parks, because again, we could spread them out, we could distribute them through the city. And I'm just thinking, in the early days of the pandemic, I live near a commuter rail lot, and when my kids would just like had it for being at home all the time, we went and played soccer in the parking lot.
Yep.
That parking lot is still only maybe like 30% occupied, right?
Yeah.
Eight months in. And so I think it would be great to think about, what if your street was green, or what if it was pedestrian only? And that will take, that's a process, but and we need to think about how to do it carefully, so we're not cutting off, again, public transit, because I hope public transit becomes a priority again. But I would love to see streets become linear park. If you think about, large parks, how do they spread out through the city on streets instead? I think it's potentially exciting.
Well, this kind of brings up another topic that's of interest to me, which is urban farming and green spaces. So, and you didn't mention green spaces, but in the Bronx is sort of perhaps disparagingly classified as a food desert, right? But at the same time, there are some amazing farms, like small, that the city sponsors, where people grow food, right? Sometimes indigenous people. The Bronx, for example, has like a burgeoning recently arrived Mexican community in the South Bronx, and they go to, to supplement what they used to do in their homeland with growing their own food. They do it in these farms, and it's an excellent way to carry these traditions forward and to, of course, eat healthy. But what do you think about long-term urban farming, maybe vertical farming, different ways of rethinking the city landscape to make sure that there's a lot more farming going on, a lot more food? And I feel like that would almost also touch this other nerve, which is to surround ourselves with, greenery. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's potentially really exciting as well. I don't know. I mean, I think, in full disclosure, I mean, I come from a farming family. I grew up in South Dakota. So
oh, cool. Okay.
So I think there's some aspects of food production, right, that are never going to be urbanized, right? But I think Yeah, I think the potential of vertical farming, and I think, last time I was in New York too, I saw some really great rooftop gardens in Brooklyn. I see a comment, gardens are the best kind of
Yeah.
outdoor classrooms. Yes, and that's
Yeah.
something we're talking about with our group at MIT. We're working, we had a group called City Sprouts talk to our students last week because they do outdoor gardens. It's a form of STEM education, right? Teaches children to be reliant, teaches them about healthy eating. And so I think a lot of the value of urban gardening is not really sustenance farming. I don't know if it'll ever tip the scale in that people can be truly sustenance, but it can build community, and it can build mental health, and it can build health habits in ways that go far beyond like thinking about, okay, how many pounds and how productive
Right.
yeah.
Right. It's more, it has like its symbolic value is perhaps greater than its real food.
Well, capital value, right? And
Capital
so,
value,
which is
yeah.
also like, how do we start to value things not
Right.
solely for its capital, right?
Yes, of
So,
course.
yeah.
I have another question here. It seems like a pandemic design built environment requires complex multidisciplinary solutions. So how can architects take the first steps to working on multidisciplinary solutions? And really, are architects the main driving force? I mean, are they the only voices in the room? If we're going to talk about inclusion, who gets the seat at the table when we talk about how to solve our problems with pandemic readiness and disaster readiness?
I mean, I think architects can serve a valuable role at being at the table. I would not say they are leaders, and I think that's actually been a problem in the profession. And that's something I try and point out through my research is like the sort of the worst effects of these were when architects came in and claimed public health knowledge, but were using it sort of more as metaphor or sort of experiment, sort of like a fun thing to play
Right.
on more than thinking about actual epidemiology. That said, I think we can serve a great role in sort of like visualizing and synthesizing what these solutions might look like, and also advocating for the built environment as an important way to address again both climate change resilience and pandemic resilience. I think for architects, this is a moment of being humble and figuring out the language of other fields. One of the hardest and most instructive experiences I had was being an architect that was hired by a public health department, which was at my previous job at University of Hawaii at Manoa. So, but working with public health researchers and public health professors, and thinking about collaboration, right? And again, just learning each other's methods and language was really crucial and instructive for me.
There's this other question that I have here that I also want to ask in a certain way. The question is, how do you convince people / cities in areas that are susceptible to flooding, for example, to move, or people who live in fire prone areas to move? And where are the best regions to promote development? I mean, you're saying in regards to like urban planning and housing communities that they often just displace people. So where are the places? Well, there's two questions here. What are the best practices for convincing people that this is a good idea to leave their home, in other words, and create a new home?
Right.
And then where are the best places in the US at any rate that we should be looking at for redevelopment or further development, I guess I should say.
mean, like I said, it's a really tough question, and another like super instructive period in my life was being in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And it came out with, I don't know if anybody's heard about this, but the green dot map. And basically, like, not too long after people were just starting to trickle back in the city, they came out with this map and these really sloppily drawn like large green circles that were projected on the city. And they said, okay, these whole areas are going to be turned into parks or green space because they're low lying and they're risky. And you know that, but it's still people's homes, right? And they've fought for it. And I think, we have to think about how many of these areas, the areas that are most affected by climate change, are often low income or communities of color or immigrant communities. They live there because those are affordable swaths of land, but they may also not be able to get insured. So it's really difficult and tricky. And I don't know if I don't know the answer, because it's people that are like much more skilled in what we call managed retreat, the theory of managed retreat for climate change is, where you're sort of like thinking about, yes, how do you move people away from these hazardous areas. You know, to some extent, a lot of it is just promising people a safer future, guaranteeing it to them, because I think too often in our society we still leave housing up as a matter of like free and personal choice, where it's not. You know, you're very sort of conscripted to where you can live, and so it's difficult, and we have to be cognizant of the emotions and ties people have to their homes. And that's why I think, you know, thinking about incremental building in place, right, is really really crucial. So
it kind of reminds me of, you know, when the Carter administration began, he came in with like much of his platform, what he wanted to do, it was environmental. And really, I mean, from today's standpoint, we look back and these look like really great ideas, but in very idealistic, but also like really sound, based on science, based on some of the social change that was coming from the tail end of the 60s and then into the 70s. And it seemed like such a great opportunity for our country to turn around in the late 70s, right? After the gas shortages and whatnot. And then I know like the story that when Carter then lost the second term, and then the Reagan administration moved in, Carter, like when he had become president, put solar panels on the roofs of the White House, right? Which is like largely symbolic, but it's important, right? It sets a tone, and we know that like tone is really important with whoever is in the White House, right? We've learned that, if anything else, we learned that in the last 4 years. But when Reagan came in, they tore up the solar panels and they just threw them off the side of the White House. And of course, you know, then 8 years of Reagan, and we know where any student of recent American history knows where that has brought us. But I think what I'm getting at is there's this sort of like iconoclastic approach that we're in right now, where administrations come in, and we're about to see one, I'm sure, in January, where everything the previous administration did that was perhaps seen as, you know, activist or beyond the pale is then undone quickly with executive orders and policy. So my fear is that all of these things we're talking about, which are really great, are going to be perhaps cast in this light of socialism or social experimentation, and then eventually within 4 to 8 years they'll be undone as unceremoniously as they were enacted. How do you feel from a policy level, and perhaps even a design standpoint, all the things we're talking about can be done in such a way to avoid that reaction?
I don't know, it's hard because I mean, you need to do all of these things carefully, but I think if you show people sometimes that, and again, this is where the value of being a designer comes into play. If you show people what a better future might look like that addresses these ideas, and let them invest in it, right? And I mean, most people agree, like most people like parks.
Yeah.
So can we deploy parks in a way?
Yeah, nobody's anti-park, right?
Yeah, that also soak up floodwaters, right? But I mean, can we also deploy parks in a way that don't, but can we also deploy parks and at the same time ensure neighborhoods are not gentrified, right, by controlling rents or whatever? So it comes hand in hand, right? Because we know parks have that effect too. But this is to say, and this is, you know, as Boston's starting to undergo a lot of transformation on its coast, where it's building a new ring of parks that are also going to be working as flood infrastructure and would bring some more green space to underserved communities. Hopefully they're thinking about the gentrification question as well. Once you show people what this could look like, though, and they invest in it and they see it, then maybe they won't want it to be changed. You know, much like, you know, sort of this attack on the suburbs that Trump was launching in the last few months, right. Where he was threatening that, you know, what they're going to build affordable housing in your suburb. Yeah. And I think a lot of people definitely say, like, my suburb's just fine. You know, like, that's not happening here, because he's working on this again, like sort of Reaganite idea of of sort of like evil, unhealthy cities and healthy suburbs. And a lot of people said, well, it hasn't changed, and it's fine. I mean, for better or for worse, right? People also say that I don't want anything to change, and therefore I'm gonna vote for the status quo. But if you're able to change things over time, and they say, yes, this is nice, I like it, then maybe they will resist, and they'll say like, oh, it does all these, it does all these things, but it has to be done incrementally. It has to be done on a community level. You have to, so
I mean,
one interesting story, when I worked in Hawaii, we were looking at street transformations. We're looking at streets that have been changed over to more bike lanes and roundabouts, traffic calming, and we were working with a community group in Kauai, which is a small island. The mayor of Kauai, because you have mayors of the entire island. He was actually a former Parks and Rec manager, and he told us, he said people didn't want the roundabouts. He said people they hate the idea of roundabouts. He actually went to door to door sometimes, and he would go to gatherings, and he would say, it's going to be okay, it's going to do all these things, it's going to look really nice, right? So I think that's the other thing, is like built environment change to some extent has to happen on the community level.
I mean, that is one of the defining principles of our democracy in the US, which is that there is a federal government, and it can either be toothless or not, but there's also state level governments. And in New York, I can't speak for your governor, but our governor has been like very sound with his pandemic response. And then we also have like the mayor of the city, which mixed feelings on him. There's a lot of like back and forth about him, but then there are just really the strongest thing that I've seen about New York, the city, is just people in the community. Like look at what we just come through, and who we are on the back end of it, hopefully, knock on wood. And I really do feel like we're stronger than ever. So I feel like there are solutions at the federal level, but really where it's going to happen is on the ground at the community level. I can totally agree with you. And one other question I would have related to that is, what about the World Health Organization? Like, do they have an organ? Is there an organ of the World Health Organization that deals with this? And what are their plans?
There's and I've sort of been maybe overly concentrated on American policy in the course of writing the book, but actually, the World Health Organization comes in, is really valuable, because they were the first ones that said health is not just the absence of disease, right? But it's the overall quality of life that you're living. And that was an extremely important declaration that they made in 1976, and opens up avenues to looking at, again, food access and built environment and all these basically building blocks of preventative health, right? And resilient health, and not just preventing and treating disease. And so I haven't been following it, but I do believe they've been coming out with recommendations on, again, and this is, again, regulations that are much more easily passed in European cities, other cities with nationalized healthcare systems, right? Where they understand that the burden of health is on everybody, not just on the individual, where they're thinking about recommendations for more bike lanes and more parks and
all that good European stuff.
Sarah,
thank you so much for meeting with us today. Unfortunately, that's pretty much all the time we have, although I feel like I could talk to you for another 3 hours. But one thing I wanted to do before you leave, could you just share your social media information, and you can just type it into the chat box if you want, or
let me see, everybody. I guess my most I don't update it very often.
That's okay.
I have a Twitter, but that I've been trying to stay off.
Yeah. Those days are over, though. We got to get back on.
I know.
We got to get back on. This is great. And also, you can, if anyone's interested in Professor Carr's work, you can look her up on the Northeastern website. That's how I found her. So something, your search engine optimization is working over there in Boston. So thank you again. We'll see you next week at the next Tuesday. This is for everybody. We're going to have the final panel discussion amongst all the people who have been talking with for the past 7 weeks. We're all going to get together. I'm going to try to stay out of it, but we're all going to talk about commonalities and amongst our fields, and really just about how everyone has a distinct definition of what diversity and inclusion is. So it should be really great. So thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Sarah, for talking with us today, and we will see everyone next week. Okay. Thank you so much. Bye, Sarah. Thank you.